So for those just joining us this evening, we have already covered in our Old Testament survey a lot of eras of the Old Testament. We covered the beginnings and the patriarch era, which are found in the book of Genesis. We covered the Exodus era, which is found in the next 4 books of the Old Testament: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We covered the conquest, which is in the book of Joshua, and the Judges era, which is also the book of Judges and Ruth, and the beginning of 1 Samuel. And then we shifted into the United Monarchy era, which is when the 3 kings that ruled over the entire kingdom and all 12 of the tribes, Saul, David, and Solomon. And you'll notice on the genealogy that I just handed out, I have David and Solomon at the top, and then below them, from Rehoboam on, it is the divided kingdom period, and they only ruled over the southern kingdom and such.
Sorry?
Yes. Now, as has been mentioned, and as everybody could tell in the Kahoot, like, this is the less well-versed portion of the Old Testament that we have just gotten to. It's what I call the dark ages of the Old Testament, where almost nobody knows anything, and the average Christian in any evangelical church has not read this stuff, does not know this stuff. However, one of the reasons why we're doing it is because it's over half of the Old Testament that we still have left. It's a lot of the writings, all the prophetic writings, in fact, and a good chunk of the history is all in this era. And so that is a very large portion of Scripture that a wide swath of Christians are just simply very illiterate on. And this is a Bible literacy course, so I'm trying to make you literate about that which is illiterate. And for some of you, if you've read through this before, you'll make new connections. If you've never read through it before, consider this your first introduction, and you won't remember all of it, but it'll be a little more familiar the next time somebody brings it up. So, moving on. Last week we didn't quite finish everything, and so we're going to start on the southern line of kings, and we're going to look at King Asa first. He was the 3rd king over the kingdom of Judah, and he reigned for 41 years. And as with all the southern kings, his capital city was in Jerusalem. Now, Asa was one of the more righteous kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. As a rule of thumb, the kings of Judah were righteous in the early days, and it got worse at the end. Well, one of the first things Asa did is he expelled all of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the land. And he also purged the land of idols. And so this was an important first step that he took. There was always a large amount of idolatry that infiltrated the kingdom of Judah, and every generation kind of vacillated towards or away from idol worship. And so Asa, in his generation, purged the land of these things. Now, some of the significant events that happened in his reign is, to begin with, he had 10 years of peace at the beginning of his reign. And this is not a particularly peaceful period of history, so that was very significant for Judah. During that period of peace, he fortified all of the towns of Judah. And it was actually during this period that his son Jehoshaphat, who was going to take over the throne upon his death, was born. That was in the 6th year. After 10 years of peace, though, he gets attacked by Zerah the Cushite. And does anybody remember where the Cushites came from? This is...
Like Africa?
Cush is in Africa, and where is it relative to Egypt?
South?
South of Egypt. So this would be Ethiopia, Sudan area is where Cush came from. Yes?
How long was his reign?
41 years.
Thanks.
Yep. And anyhow, so this actually is a period of known Egyptian history where the Cushites actually came up, conquered all of Egypt, and subjugated it, and they were more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, and they felt like the Egyptians had fallen into apostasy, and so they reintroduced all the Egyptian gods to the Egyptians. And during that point in time, they came up and attacked Judah, trying to push their empire further. They had an army of 1 million men. Asa calls on the Lord. Judah defeats the Cushites, and they get pushed back.
Wait, wasn't the army of 1,000,000 men part of, like, that one video thingy we watched in Mr. Shimino's class?
No.
No, that was Thermopylae in Greece.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is an obscure battle I've never seen in a history textbook. So,
There's going to be
yeah,
a
a lot of those obscure battles. Anyhow, so this is a good start for Asa, and the Lord is with him in the battle. And actually, after this battle, there's an obscure prophet who doesn't write a book, which is why he's even more obscure. But a prophet by the name of Azariah prophesies to Asa that the Lord was with him. And after this battle, Asa goes on and purges the land further from the idolatry. And so this involves repairing the altar of the Lord in front of the temple. Apparently the altar in the temple complex broke down from time to time, needed repairs. Asa's grandmother had put an Asherah pole up, and Asa cut that Asherah pole down. And then he deposed his grandmother Maacah from her position of influence. This would be Rehoboam's wife, who was still alive during the reign of Asa in the early days. And so she was an influential person in the court, and he strips her of her influence and is part of cleansing the land, partly because she adopted all this pagan worship. And he also goes up and gets rid of idols up in the villages of Ephraim, because Asa was able to push the border north of the tribal allotment of Benjamin into Ephraim. And so this had been part of the northern kingdom, but the border went back and forth a little bit for a while. And then there's a verse here in 2 Chronicles 15. Asa gathered all Judah and Benjamin and those from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon who were residing with them, for great numbers had deserted to him from Israel when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. So for about 300 years, good solid 250, there was this rivalry between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. They were all tribes of Israel, and there's this sifting, and the righteous people from the north that recognized that the hand of God was down in the south tended to abandon their inheritance and migrate south and join the kingdom of Judah. Here we have another incident of that, and this is 3 generations after the kingdom was originally divided in half. Next in Asa's reign, a war with Baasha breaks out. Now, we already talked about Baasha last week. He was one of the northern kings. He overthrew Nadab by assassinating him, and then took over the kingdom, reigned for a good while. Baasha starts fortifying the southern border, probably because Asa had been encroaching on it, and Asa, instead of going to war with Baasha directly, ends up making a treaty with the king of Aram. And Aram was to the northeast of the kingdom of Israel. You want to get a map for Maddie, Micaiah? There's some on the back table there. One of those. Yep. Anyhow, this ends up being a really big mistake, because all of a sudden the Arameans start attacking and going to war, and you'll see that this was a geopolitical disaster for the kingdom of Judah, actually. Anyway, so Asa sends a whole bunch of silver and gold up to get the Arameans to attack Israel. Aram attacks Baasha in Israel.
This looks
Yep, that'll work.
Thank you.
Point out where the Arameans are from. Arameans are there. Israel and Judah are the highlighted area. Yep. I will get you an updated map of the divided kingdom next week. I didn't print that off. Yeah. Anyhow, so the funny thing about this is the Arameans are descended from Laban, going back all the way to the days of Jacob. And they had set a pillar of rocks saying this is the boundary between the Arameans and the Israelites in Gilead, or on the border of Gilead, and we're not supposed to go across that. And Judah just invited the Arameans to cross that border and ransack their brethren in the northern kingdom. So this goes well for the Arameans. They get a huge area around the Sea of Galilee that they conquer from the northern kingdom, and this definitely weakens Baasha. He has to move his army from the south up to the north. Asa takes advantage of the opportunity and carries off all of Baasha's fortification building materials, and then he uses that to fortify his border with the northern kingdom. So this goes very bad for the north, and eventually it will turn around. This is pointed out as being a foolish idea by Hanani the seer, another obscure prophet of the Old Testament. This may be his one and only thing actually he ever says. It might come up again, we'll see. Asa gets rebuked. Don't think Asa took to that very well, though. And then, unfortunately, for having been a righteous and God-fearing king through most of his reign, Asa has a bad demise. He gets a disease in his feet in his 39th year, but he doesn't seek the Lord for healing. He only goes to doctors and physicians. And in those days, doctors and physicians were not as skilled and knowledgeable as they are today, and so it's kind of like the equivalent of going to a witch doctor instead of seeking the Lord and the high priest. Not quite the same, but you get the idea. He does not recover from this disease, and then he dies in his 41st year, thus ending the reign of Asa.
Is that the 39th year of his reign? Or
39th year of his reign. All right, and then we shift to the north. We're going to go up to Omri's dynasty, and we'll do just a little bit of review here because that was a messy
That's
transition.
still in the line of David.
Nope, Northern Kingdom is not in the line of David. So the genealogy that I handed out to you is not going to include that. And Fritz, I forgot to print off that dynasty. Shoot it.
Because the Northern Dynasty is like chopped up because they are constantly.
Yeah, there's 5 or 6 of them.
Yeah, so they don't have things figured out.
They rebel against David, and then the guy who leads them, he has a son, and the son becomes king, and the son gets assassinated. And then the guy who assassinated him reigns, and then the guy who assassinated him has a son, his son becomes king. And that guy gets assassinated, and then the guy who assassinated him reigns for like less than a year.
You
And
can
then
use this as a reference.
he's
I'll
about
get
to
you
get
a clean copy
assassinated,
later.
and so he burns down the palace.
Oh no, that guy ran for 7 days.
You two can use this as a reference, and I'll get you more copies printed later.
And then the guy who then
Okay.
takes over after he
Is that
burns
his
down the
son?
palace,
And then that's his
then
son?
fights a civil war.
Yep.
So
All right.
these guys, what's the line between them?
Married, I believe.
A bold person is a male typically. If there's a dashed line horizontally, they're married. Vertical lines show the line of descent.
She's female, they're married,
Yep.
that's their daughter, that's
Because
their
none
son,
of these
that's their
names
son.
sound female or male.
That's
Right.
their son and that is his son-in-law. Oh no, that's their son-in-law.
Jezebel's the only female that we
Is she
notice.
the one that fell over the tower?
Yep, she's the one that gets thrown out of the tower.
You
Lots
don't
of
get
fun
named.
stories and drama
Say
here.
that. I can do it.
Married, or daughter, son, son. That's his son-in-law, or no, that's their son-in-law. From their married to their daughter, and that's their daughter's son.
Alright, so I've got it on my slides here, a quick overview of the whole
Wait,
dynasty
they
of
let
Omri.
Women reign?
It happens
Yeah.
occasionally,
Yeah.
Yeah, queens are
yeah.
Wow.
So, this is the dynasty of Omri. Omri is the first one. His son is Ahab. Ahab reigns 22 years. You don't need to write all these details down because it's in a lot of the genealogies and handouts and such. And we'll go over all of these individually here.
In your big map, or
Yep.
the big sheet, it's all in there.
It's on the timeline as well.
Wait,
The son of Ahab is Ahaziah. And I believe Ahaziah and Jehoram are brothers. Yes. One dies and then the other one takes over as king after him because the first one didn't have any sons. And then the screwy one is Athaliah. And her genealogy is not crystal clear in the scriptures. My current understanding is that she was a granddaughter of Omri, but probably not through Ahab and Jezebel, as depicted on the genealogy. However, most people do think that, or depict her as the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. So the genealogy as represented is a commonly way of understanding or putting it together. The way it's worded in the scripture makes it impossible to figure out precisely how she's connected. We do know for sure she's a granddaughter of Omri, she's in the dynasty. The crazy thing about her is that even though she's connected to a northern dynasty, she rules in the south, in the kingdom of Judah. And we'll get to that story here shortly.
Well, you know, there's a lot of women in history that do some pretty crazy things.
Yes. Yep.
Didn't we go over one last week, the queen? I forgot which one it was, but she was doing some crazy stuff. She was maybe not pagan. No, like a wicked queen of Israel or something.
Has there been a queen of Israel yet?
No, I don't think so.
No, I think the wife of Jeroboam
Yeah,
was
maybe her.
probably the one you're referring to.
Yeah.
So, alright, so jumping in here with Omri. This is a little review from last week, but we need that for context. Omri was the commander of the army of Israel, and he saw an opportunity to overthrow Zimri, who reigned in for 7 days. Yep. And so then there's a civil war that breaks out after Zimri gets overthrown because Tibni, the son of Ginath, also wants to be king. So Omri and Tibni fight over the throne for 4 years. Tibni gets defeated and dies, and all of his followers get killed as well. And then Omri has the kingdom. Now, if you remember, the last thing Zimri did as king was he burned the palace down in Tirzah. How much of the city went down in flames at the same time is unknown. However, it had been laid siege to at that point in time as well. So one of the first things that Omri does is he moves the capital from Tirzah to Samaria. And that is still inside the tribal inheritance of Ephraim, so it's not geographically moved too far. But then he's able to reign there for 6 years after moving the capital over there. And Samaria is the central city then of the northern kingdom for the rest of its existence, and that's also where the term Samaritans come from. And it is, well, the chief city there.
Samaritans, because they were the northern Israel.
We'll get to the Samaritans later.
They're fun.
In a few weeks, we'll explain their origin story.
Okay.
They're
Yep.
funky.
They are, yep. Omri doesn't get a lot of time in the Bible. He actually gets a lot more time in archaeological digs, though. They have come up with inscriptions referring to Omri a lot more regularly than Ahab. Ahab is one of the few characters in this period of history of the Bible that you may have actually heard, and that's because Elijah and Elisha interact with Ahab and his sons quite a bit. So this is the one window of this period of time that comes up in sermons from time to time, and you may have heard reflections on it. But anyway, Ahab marries the daughter of the king of Sidon.
Wait, Ahab is Omri's son, right?
Yep, Ahab is Omri's son. He marries Jezebel, who is the daughter of King Ethbal of Sidon. And Jezebel and Ahab introduce Baal worship into the kingdom of Israel. And that knocks the kingdom of Israel down a notch further. Remember the sins of Jeroboam, where they were worshiping the calf gods at Dan and Bethel. And that was just putting an image to God and saying this calf god is the image of God that we worship. But they were still kind of following the Levitical prescriptions and such.
And it was like these are the ones that brought us out of Egypt.
Right.
They're still
Just perverted form of the true worship that was supposed to be happening. Baal worship, that's just wholesale jumping into the Canaanite paganism. And the people of Sidon were Canaanites that survived the purge in the conquest area because they were further to the north. So they build the temple and an altar to Baal in Samaria, they build Asherah poles, and they rebuild Jericho in the time of Ahab. And if you remember back to the conquest era, Joshua, after destroying Jericho, uttered a curse. Cursed be the one man who rebuilds the city of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn, he'll rebuild its walls, and at the cost of his youngest son, he will set its gates and bars. And that actually happened, and that man lost his oldest son and his youngest son to some supernatural death. And that happens in the reign of Ahab. and it's given in the scriptures as just a point of how far they have fallen away from the true worship of God and how far they have moved away from following and seeking after God. So during Ahab's reign, there's a famine for 3 years. There's also war with Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram. The Arameans continued fighting with the kingdom of Israel. He was at peace with Sidon, though, and he was also at peace with Judah. And so they only had the front up in the northeast that was under conflict constantly. Now, Ahab is a rather colorful character. One of his great points of color actually comes when he's trying to get a vineyard from Naboth. And this is what brings the end of the dynasty, actually, initiates the end of it. Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. Naboth wasn't going to sell it to him, so Jezebel arranges for Naboth to get unjustly executed. And Elijah comes and rebukes Ahab. And in that rebuke, he says that his house will become like Jeroboam's and Baasha's. Those are the two previous dynasties that are no more. And he specifically utters this curse, which is what was spoken to both Jeroboam and Baasha. Anyone belonging to the house of Ahab who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat, and anyone who dies in the open country, the birds of the heavens shall eat. And every single one of his descendants was going to be cut off. Now, Ahab knew what happened to the previous two dynasties, and hearing this being uttered to him caused him to tear his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. And so even though he was the most wicked king of Israel or Judah in this entire period out of 42 kings, God took note of his humility and decided, I'm not going to bring this judgment in his generation, it'll happen in the generation of his sons, because he repented and humbled himself, and God pointed that out to Elijah. So Ahab continues bumbling on for a while, and then finally God decides, I just need to kill this guy. And so he entices Ahab to attack the Arameans in battle at Ramoth Gilead. At this time he is allied with Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, who we're going to learn about in a bit here yet. He dies after this battle. He gets wounded by an arrow shot at random. The story actually is where the prophet Micaiah comes in. That's Micaiah's namesake. Prophet Micaiah is brought before the king at the behest of Jehoshaphat, actually, and there's a really funny exchange. If you get the opportunity to read that chapter, I believe it is 1 Kings 22.
That sounds right.
So maybe 21, maybe 23, but that is a funny chapter in my mind. Now, the author of the Kings ends up spending an awful lot of time talking about Elijah the prophet and Elisha the prophet. So we're going to look here a little bit and digress away from the Kings. You'll notice on the timeline, you can actually peg pretty concretely when Elijah and Elisha prophesied, because there's significant events that you can correlate. And so you'll find them on the timeline there. And so his ministry begins at some point during Ahab's reign, ends at approximately 885, plus or minus a couple years perhaps. But Elijah is a fiery prophet, and he's kind of like the archetype of prophets in the Old Testament. And so, not necessarily the best example of a prophet, but he's the one most people think of, and when you think of a prophet, most of the characteristics are derived off of Elijah.
So did he actually have like long gray hair and big bushy beard?
That's just the flannel graph rendering of him. I don't think he was actually that old.
Wait,
So,
which one do you, oh yeah, because we used that one.
yep.
Yeah, okay.
Anyhow, so he was the one who prophesied that 3-year famine during the reign of Ahab. And Ahab puts him on the most wanted list. And so Elijah disappears. He gets fed by ravens for a while, and then he goes and lives with a widow in Zarephath in Sidon, outside of the territory of Israel. So he lives in exile for a period of time. Yep, and that's actually where Jezebel's neighborhood was, so in Sidon. At the end of this 3-year famine, he confronts Ahab on Mount Carmel, and this is the famous story that inspires many sermons, where you have the prophets of Baal on one side with one altar, and there's 400 of those prophets, and then you have Elijah on the other side with one altar, and the prophets of Baal spend the whole day crying out to the god Baal to light the altar or the offering on fire, and
He's the thunder god.
because he's the thunder god, and so you're expecting lightning from heaven to come down and light up the offering. After a full day's worth of this and nothing happening, then Elijah goes ahead and puts his offering on the altar. He douses it in water with like 12 jars of water so that it's absolutely soaking wet and saturated and should not be able to light on fire. And this demonstrates that he's not just pulling a fast one on everybody and has some trick that's going to make this thing light on fire. Then he prays and asks God to light it up, and lightning or fire from heaven comes down and lights it up, and not only consumes the offering on the altar, but it completely scorches the entire altar, and all the water that's in the trench around the altar gets completely dried up. And it's a very powerful depiction of this. And so then the people of Israel kill off all the prophets of Baal because he's shown to be powerless, and then a rain comes for the first time in 3 years. Now this is a really good day for Elijah, but then Jezebel is all upset that all of her prophets just got killed off, and so she says, "Far be it from me if Elijah's head remains on his shoulders by the end of tomorrow."
Wait, doesn't he race King Ahab back to Jerusalem?
Yep, on foot.
Samaria?
He beats a chariot in the rain.
That's mad.
But anyway, so then Elijah flees off to Mount Horeb in the desert, which is probably also Mount Sinai. And so he's going back to where the revelation came to Moses and where the Israelites hung out in the wilderness for a ridiculously long time.
How do you spell Sinai?
S-I-N-A-I.
Thanks.
God speaks to him there, gives him some instructions. And then finishing up on Elijah the prophet, Elisha begins attending him as a apprentice, essentially. And he goes and rebukes Ahab about Naboth of Jezreel, which we mentioned earlier. And then he sends a letter of rebuke to Jehoram, the king of Judah, as well, before his end. And then he gets taken to heaven in a whirlwind, and Elisha and him were separated by the chariots of fire that came down from heaven to take him up. And Elijah is one of 2 people that did not die in the Old Testament. They were just taken to heaven alive. Enoch being the other one in the pre-flood world. So he's a very significant character. And there's lots of other really colorful stories about him.
Oh wait, was he the 50 man and a captain come out?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that happens there too. So, anyhow, moving on to Ahab's son. Ahaziah was going to take over the throne, and he's one of the few kings that we know for certain had an overlapping reign based on how the year of Jehoshaphat's reign that he started reigning. And so, about 1 year before Ahab dies, Ahab elevated his son as a co-regent, is the way it's termed. And that essentially is a way for a king to ensure which son is going to take over after they die. And this happens just a handful of times that we can see in the scriptures. So he continues in the sin of his father and his mother, and the ways of Ahab and Jezebel, and he also continues in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. And so that means they're worshiping the Baals, and they are worshiping the calf gods. And he falls through a lattice at his palace and injures himself on the way down. And this is where Elijah is summoned. He prophesies that he's going to die from his injuries, and in the process, 100 men get burned up by fire because he calls fire down from heaven, and the Lord delivers. And
Because they were like sent to fetch him, right?
yeah, they were sent not to fetch him, they were sent to fetch No, actually, they were supposed to bring him. Yep, that's the way the story goes.
So
Supposed
that's the second time he's called fire from the heavens. And
Yeah, that's the second time he's called fire down from heaven, and that's where James and John, the disciples of Jesus, are like, hey, should we call fire down from heaven? They're like, this is so amazing, we can do like what Elijah did. So, and the fire from heaven, I'm pretty sure, is a Hebrew euphemism for lightning. Not absolutely positive on that, but I'm almost positive that it's a figure of speech, fire from heaven being lightning. Because when lightning strikes in a forest, it almost always starts a fire, and that is a fire that came down from heaven. And you'll see a few instances of this throughout the Old Testament. That is the conclusion I have come to, rather than say the Sodom and Gomorrah fire and brimstone coming down. That was different.
Very, very direct.
Yep. So Ahaziah's reign is really short, and Joram, his brother, takes over, and he actually gets rid of the sacred stone of Baal, and so he brings the kingdom of Israel up a notch in his time. But he does continue in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat.
So they're less bad.
Less bad, but still bad. So, let's see. Joram actually has several significant events that happen in his reign. One of the first things he tries to do is resubjugate the people of Moab. Moab was one of the kingdoms to the southeast of Israel and Judah, and kingdoms in these days like to subjugate other kingdoms so that they could pay tribute, and then the subjugating kingdom would be a lot richer, and the kingdom that was subjugated would be poorer and less likely to go attack them. So Joram tries to do that, and he allies himself with Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom at that time. Elisha the prophet ends up meeting them in the desert and prophesies the defeat of Moab, and I believe the Moabites end up actually killing themselves, thinking that they were being attacked by another army, and so it was a pretty interesting conflict the way that breaks out. But the fascinating thing about it is that this battle is actually recorded in an old inscription that was recorded by the Moabites themselves, and this was found in 1868. And so this is an event that is recorded in the scriptures, and we, in the last couple hundred years, found this stone that records that same event in ancient Moabite language. And so this is another point of archaeological evidence that is very much supporting the scriptures of what said in the Bible actually did happen, and this is a contemporary inscription.
What's that stone
What's the
called?
stone?
That is the Mesha Stela, which is on the previous page here. It's on the bottom, second to the last line there. Mesha, M-E-S-H-A, Stela. And we're going to find quite a few of these here over the next few weeks. This was a common practice of kings in those days, is when you have a great victory, you set up a monument, and people apparently were literate enough that they would go ahead and write in an inscription talking about their victories.
I just spelled supports with a B.
Yeah.
Because I'm writing so fast.
So it was written in Moabite, but it was.
This is written in ancient Moabite,
Okay.
and it references that battle. It's going to come from the Moabite perspective, which is going to have a propaganda slant to it, but everybody's convinced this is referring to this battle. So I don't remember exactly
So it was
what
written
these.
by the people that Jerome defeated.
Yeah,
Okay.
yep, Joram, yep.
Jerome. Yeah, Jerome.
Alright, so moving on, we get to Elisha the prophet. He's another major focus of the writer of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. He follows directly after Elijah, inherits a double portion of his spirit, and if you read through the miracles of Elijah and Elisha, you will find that Elisha performs precisely twice as many miracles as Elijah, as recorded in the scriptures. And he prophesies for approximately 50 years, so he had a really long
Twice as long.
prophetic ministry, yeah. And he'll pop up quite a bit next week, I believe, as well. So some of the things that he does, there's a well that is poisoned and he heals the bad water so that people don't die from drinking it. And he curses some young people at Bethel that were mocking him, and a whole bunch of, or 2 bears came out and mauled a bunch of them.
Oh my
There was the ever-flowing oil that poured out of a jar until all the jars were filled up, and so there was a creative miracle. Then there was a poisoned stew, and he neutralized it supernaturally, because throwing flour into poisoned stew is not going to take care of the problem. And then he's got 100 people that he needs to feed, and they only have 20 loaves of bread, which I think you could render as like 20 tortillas, not full loaves like we think of, because they had unleavened bread, which would be closest to a tortilla.
What's
Hmm?
unleaded bread?
Unleavened.
It's like this huge sheet. It's
Yeah.
Kind of like,
It's bread without yeast,
what's the
and so it doesn't rise.
Oh, okay.
Yep, and so it's either going to be like a pancake or a tortilla or something halfway in between
Kind
there.
of looks like a really hard ashen gyro, but it's not
Yeah.
as good or tasty.
Right.
It's nice and risen.
I imagine it depends
Yeah.
where you put it.
So this kind of foreshadows the feedings of the 5,000 and the 4,000 that Jesus performs in the New Testament, because he feeds 100 people with just 20 loaves of bread. And so this is rendered in the scriptures as a supernatural multiplication of food. It should not have fed that many people.
Foreshadows Jesus feeding of the 5,000.
And then Naaman was a general of the Aramean army, and he gets healed of leprosy. And continuing on, he calls an axe head up out of the water after it flew into a river by the Jordan River. Iron does not tend to float, but that day iron floated. And then he assisted the northern kingdom of Israel against all the wars of the Arameans. And at this time, Joram's likely the king of Israel, and Samaria gets sieged, and the siege gets lifted. And Elisha was the one who prophesied that they would be saved. They also prophesied the death of Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, and that Hazael would succeed him as king, and that happens. And then he also sends to have Jehu anointed the king over of Israel. So Elisha interacts very heavily with the northern kingdom, and we will see him popping up when we get into the dynasty of Jehu next week. Let's see if we can quick blitz this. Alright, so jumping from the northern kingdom down to the southern kingdom, we're going to go to Jehoshaphat, and I've mentioned him a few times here. So we're going to step backwards and step south. Jehoshaphat reigns 25 years, as noted in the timeline, from 914 to 889. Then his son Jehoram takes over, and then another one, Ahaziah. And he was the son of Jehoram, and this is where it gets confusing, because we have a Joram and an Ahaziah in the north, and we have a Jehoram and an Ahaziah in the south, at the exact same time.
Ugh.
Yes,
It's so.
it
It's
is
such a
really
mess.
frustrating and confusing.
Have fun on the Kahoot with that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's gonna be great.
Yes. Anyhow, Jehoram in the south also has 3 overlapping years reigning with Jehoshaphat according to the timeline. He became king at 32. Ahaziah only reigns 2 years. He becomes king at 22. We'll see how his demise goes.
Yes.
All right, we're hitting 8 o'clock. Does everybody have 5 minutes so we can finish this up quick?
Yes.
Okay. So Jehoshaphat is a righteous king. He's one of the best kings of the southern kingdom. His downfall is allying with wicked kings in the northern kingdom. but he doesn't do anything stupid in the south. So he removes all the high places and the Asherah poles that were still around after his father Asa had removed all of them. And then he actually sends officials out from Jerusalem to teach all the people of Judah what the law of Moses actually says and how to follow and worship God properly. And during his reign, there is generally peace in Judah. And one of the downsides of his alliances is that he marries his son Jehoram to Athaliah. Remember, she was the granddaughter of Omri, possibly the daughter of Ahab, but definitely a relative. And so she introduces a lot of awful stuff into the south, but that doesn't happen, it doesn't become a prominent issue until after Jehoshaphat is dead.
Wait,
What?
oh, okay.
Okay. So Jehoshaphat does have a few wars. He fights against the Arameans with Ahab in that famous battle at Ramoth Gilead where Ahab dies. So we're seeing that same battle from the other direction here. Then after Ahab is dead, he tries to build a fleet of trading ships, and he partners with Ahaziah in order to do that, probably because Ahaziah had more timber in his land than Judah had in their land. And they station it down at Ezion-Geber, which is way down south on the Red Sea. The idea is we're going to restore the trading links that Solomon had established 5 generations earlier. But this whole fleet of trading ships is destroyed and they're unable to trade, and it comes to nothing. Later, he allies with Joram, and they march against the Moabites, and this is when Elijah comes and prophesies, and the Moabites are defeated. That's that battle that is recorded on the stela of Misha Stela. Now, Judah does get attacked once or twice here during his reign. Moab, Ammon, and the Meunites all allied together to attack Judah. Jehoshaphat does the right thing. He seeks the Lord, and they march out to confront the army that was invading them. However, the other armies end up fighting amongst themselves and destroying each other, and Judah doesn't have to fight the battle, they just collect the plunder.
Isn't there a really funny story of how they discover this with like a whole bunch of like lepers or something?
Nope, that was the siege at Samaria that we referenced earlier. There's a lot of really good stories in this time frame here. There's 4 slides left. Jehoram, his son, this is the one who's married to Athaliah. Jehoram then ends up being influenced by the house of Ahab and walks in the ways of Ahab, and so they start introducing Baal worship in the south. And this is where everything goes off the rails in Judah, and the whole dynasty almost collapses in a matter of years here. He murders 6 of his brothers, he rebuilds the high places, he gets rebuked by Elijah the prophet for doing this. The Philistines and the Arabs attack Judah. They carry off a whole bunch of plunder and his wives and most of his sons. And then he dies of a lingering disease of the bowels. And his epitaph is that when he died, no one was sad that he died.
No one mourned his death.
Yep, no one mourned his death, and there was no regret that he died.
That's depressing.
Yep.
That's the Bible's way of saying that he was awful.
Yeah, exactly.
I
So his son Ahaziah was one of the survivors of those battles. He walks in the ways of Ahab as well. He is allied with Joram up in the king of Israel up in the north, and he goes and fights against Hazael, the king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead, and that battle will be referenced a lot next week. But I want to point this out here. This is the Tel Dan Stela, another one of those monuments. This was found in Dan in northern Israel just in the last 40 or 50 years. But that highlighted inscription there on the right makes a reference to the house of David. And this monument was most likely chiseled out by Hazael, celebrating his victory over the kingdom of Israel and Judah in that battle.
what's it called again?
The Tel Dan Stela. Tel, and then Dan, which is that northern city where the calf worship was happening, and then the stela is the same one. And then we have a huge crisis in both kingdoms, because Jehu comes and he's the son of Jehoshaphat, but not the one that just was king of Judah. He's the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, different Jehoshaphat. He simultaneously kills Joram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah. And then he goes on and destroys the entire house of Ahab, fulfilling Elijah's prophecy. And next week we'll look at the chaos that ensues.
So he just nuked the entire leadership
Of both kingdoms in one day.
Why do you do that?
We'll get to that next week.
So is that why it cuts off right there?
That's why it cuts, yeah, it cuts there because we have a major crisis, and I'll explain how it goes down. So we'll come back to Athaliah again.
Yeah, you know it's bad when the south cuts.
Yeah, it's really bad when the south cuts. Alright, you go ahead and wrap up the video. If you have to take off, I totally understand. Thanks for